There is a version of this story that sounds simple. A struggling hotel hires a smart executive, he makes some improvements, revenues go up, everyone goes home happy. That version is not interesting and it is not true. The real story of what happened to the MGM Grand in Las Vegas between 2001 and the mid 2000s is a story about a fundamentally different idea of where competitive advantage in the hospitality business actually comes from. It's a story about a man who walked into the largest hotel in the United States and decided that the most valuable untapped resource in the entire building wasn't the casino floor or the entertainment venues or the real estate. It was the 10,000 people who worked there who had been almost entirely left out of the conversation about how the place was run. And it's a story about what happens when you actually fix that. To understand the scale of what Gamal Aziz inherited, you need to picture the MGM Grand not as it exists today, polished, premium, full of celebrated restaurants and world-class shows, but as it was when Kirk Kerkorian built it and threw open the doors on December 18, 1993. It was, by almost every measure, the most audacious hotel construction project in American history up to that point. 5,005 rooms, a casino floor covering 171,500 square feet, at the time the largest casino on earth, a theme park attached to the back. The entire property designed around the Wizard of Oz, with animatronic Dorothy and her companions greeting guests at the entrance, an emerald city you could walk through, rooms themed after Casablanca and Gone with the Wind and Hollywood. The whole thing cost $1 billion. On opening night, Barbra Streisand performed in the arena. The ambition was staggering. Kirk Kerkorian, the Armenian-American billionaire who had already built the modern Las Vegas Strip across multiple generations of development, wanted this to be something the world had never seen. And in terms of pure scale, it absolutely was. But scale and greatness are not the same thing. The theme park hemorrhaged money and closed by 2002. The Oz theme felt dated almost immediately and was gutted in a renovation starting in 1996. The dining was mediocre, the entertainment was unremarkable. The property was enormous, yes, full, often yes, but it was in many ways trading on the name and the spectacle of its own size, rather than on anything it was genuinely doing well. The MGM Grand was the loudest house on the Strip, but the neighbors were quietly getting better. Meanwhile, something even more fundamental was wrong inside the building. An employee survey conducted around the time Aziz arrived revealed a picture that was, in retrospect, completely predictable for a property of this scale that had grown fast and organized itself around transactions rather than relationships. Workers across 10,000 roles received almost no communication from the people running the place. Managers didn't share information about what was happening in the hotel. Employees didn't know the occupancy numbers, didn't know who the VIPs were, didn't know what events were running, had no real sense of the business they were working in. They came in, did their jobs, and went home. The lights were very much on at the MGM Grand, but inside, the people running the operation were, in Aziz's own words, kept almost entirely in the dark. Gamal Aziz was not a person who should have been easy to underestimate. He was born in Cairo around 1957 or 1958 in a city saturated with the ancient heritage of hospitality. A place where tourism was not an industry but a way of life, where the pyramids drew the world to your doorstep and the quality of how you welcomed them was a source of national identity. He grew up fascinated by it. At 16, he scraped together less than $100, essentially everything he had, bought a round-trip ticket from Cairo to Paris, and talked his way into a job as a busboy. That was how his career started. A teenager in a foreign city, in a foreign language, washing dishes and clearing tables, learning from the absolute ground floor up what made someone feel genuinely welcomed versus merely served. He earned his degree in business at Cairo University, then made his way to the United States, climbing through senior management at the St. Francis in San Francisco, the Westin in Washington, the Plaza in New York, and Caesars Palace in Las Vegas. By the late 1990s, Steve Wynn had tapped him as senior vice president at Bellagio, the most expensive hotel ever built in America at the time, where Aziz oversaw the food and beverage operation and helped turn the Bellagio into the new gold standard for what a Las Vegas resort could be. That experience proved formative in a very specific way. At Bellagio, Aziz watched what happened when a property committed to genuine quality in dining, entertainment, and service, rather than simply filling beds. He watched guests drive past other hotels specifically to eat at Bellagio's restaurants. He saw the economics of destination quality. When people want to be at a place rather than just nearby it, everything changes. Revenue per guest goes up. Word of mouth becomes marketing. Loyalty becomes real rather than just a points program. When he arrived at the MGM Grand as president and COO in 2001, he brought all of that with him. And the first thing he did was not hire a design firm or commission a strategic review or restructure the executive team. The first thing he did was go out onto the casino floor and start asking guests where they were going. The answer depressed him. Almost universally, guests were leaving. They were heading to other properties for dinner. They were going to other hotels to see shows. The MGM Grand, which was theoretically a destination unto itself, was functioning as a glorified place to sleep and gamble between excursions to other people's restaurants and other people's entertainment. They would be 100% full and the restaurants would be sitting empty. It was, in his words, uninspiring. Not broken, not in crisis, just deeply, stubbornly ordinary in the face of extraordinary potential. The gap between what was and what could be, that gap was what drove everything that followed. The strategic concept Aziz would later describe as working backwards sounds almost trivially simple, but its implications were radical for an organization of this scale and culture. The idea was to stop evaluating every part of the property against its own historical performance and instead evaluate it against its theoretical potential. Don't ask, is this restaurant making money? Ask, if this space were empty and we could put anything here, what would we put? What could this space reasonably generate at its best? Then measure the current reality not against last year, but against that ideal. Suddenly, a restaurant generating $2 million in annual revenue and a respectable profit margin was not a success story. It was evidence of a missed opportunity. If the space could plausibly generate $10 million with the right concept and the right chef. That reframe was not just an analytical exercise. It was a psychological reset for the entire leadership of the property. It turned complacency into a visible and measurable cost. It made inaction expensive in a way that inaction had never been expensive before. The results were almost immediate and, over time, staggering. That gilded restaurant, Gatsby's, known more for its ornate decor than its food and turning over about 70 covers on a busy night, was replaced with Nob Hill by Michael Mina, a San Francisco-inspired concept that within a short time was doing 250 covers a night and had tripled the percentage of hotel guests eating on property rather than leaving. Tom Colicchio arrived with Kraft Steak. Joël Robuchon, arguably the greatest French chef of his generation, a man who had earned and then voluntarily retired his 3 Michelin stars, came to open an intimate fine dining restaurant at the MGM's Mansion Suites after spending 3 nights there and deciding he wanted to be part of what was happening. That last detail says something important. When a property's momentum is real, talent wants in. Aziz and his team pledged to launch a major new initiative every 3 months for 4 years. A new restaurant, shop, show, or experience on a clockwork schedule. Not only did they meet that commitment, they more than doubled it. By the time Aziz moved on to the parent company's global expansion, the MGM Grand had unveiled more than 30 major new venues since 2001. The $165 million Cirque du Soleil production Ka opened in a custom-designed 1900-seat theater. The Skylofts, 51 ultra-luxury residential-style units on the top 2 floors, redefined what a premium stay in Las Vegas could feel like. The property had transformed from a famous but middling mass-market destination into a genuine competitor at the very top of the strip. But all of this, and this is the part the strategy textbooks tend to underemphasize, depended on something that happened before the first celebrity chef was ever called. It depended on what Aziz did with the 10,000 people who worked in the building. When he arrived and saw the results of that employee survey, Aziz recognized the problem not just as a morale issue or an HR concern, but as a fundamental strategic failure. An organization with 10,000 customer-facing employees, all operating without information, without context, without a genuine stake in the outcomes they were generating. That was not just a cultural problem, it was a structural inefficiency of enormous scale. It was leaving an almost incalculable amount of value on the table. His starting point was disarmingly simple. Before every shift, not weekly, not monthly, but every single day, small groups of employees across the property gathered for what became known as the pre-shift meeting. 15 minutes, every department, every level. And in those 15 minutes, the people about to serve guests were told what was actually happening in the hotel that day. Occupancy, which celebrities were in-house, what high-value guests were arriving, what shows were running, what special events were happening, what the business was doing, numbers that management had previously treated as proprietary information to be kept away from workers were shared openly, routinely, without drama. Aziz believed, and this belief was central to everything he built, that employees were far more interested in the business they worked in than most executives gave them credit for, that they wanted to participate in something larger than their individual job description, that the old instinct to keep workers in the dark was not just paternalistic, it was strategically counterproductive. Think about what changes when a housekeeper who is about to clean a suite knows that the guest arriving this afternoon is a high-value VIP celebrating an anniversary. Or when a server knows that the hotel is at 97% occupancy and the property is having its best week in 2 years. Context transforms performance, not because workers suddenly become different people, but because they have the information they need to make good decisions in the moments that matter, the moments when management is nowhere nearby and a guest's experience hangs on what one person chooses to do with a problem or an opportunity. The survey had shown that management's interest in employee well-being was the single most important driver of engagement at the property. Not pay, not scheduling flexibility, not benefits. Though all of those matter, but whether the people at the top of the organization seemed to actually care whether the people at the bottom were okay. Aziz decided to make that care visible, structural, and relentless. He expanded MGM Grand University, the property's internal management training program, and did something most organizations would not think to do. He involved employees directly in deciding what the program should cover, not just asking for feedback after the fact, but bringing in frontline workers as genuine contributors to the curriculum. Because who knows better what managers need to learn than the people who are managed by them every day? The recognition programs that followed were designed with the same philosophy. Employee of the Month luncheons, Star of the Month boards, coffee chats with Aziz himself, mandatory recognition training for managers, appreciation dinners hosted personally by the president for top performers. Before any new recognition program was introduced, the hotel sought input from previous employee recognition champions and focus groups to make sure the programs were actually meaningful to the people they were supposed to serve, not just symbolically nice gestures designed to look good in a press release. That last detail matters more than it might seem. Most large organizations have employee recognition programs. Most of them were designed by people who thought they understood what recognition meant to frontline workers without ever asking. The result is often recognition that feels generic, performative, disconnected from what employees actually value. And when recognition feels performative, it produces cynicism rather than engagement. Aziz's instinct, consistently applied, was to treat employees as the primary experts on their own experience, rather than as recipients of programs designed for them by people who weren't like them. The results were measurable and they were striking. In a hotel employing 10,000 people, over 90% reported satisfaction with their jobs. 89% said their work had special meaning. These are not numbers you see often in any industry, and they are essentially unheard of in high-volume hospitality, where turnover is typically brutal, burnout is endemic, and the emotional labor of serving demanding customers at all hours grinds people down over time. More importantly, and this is the strategic point, happy, informed, engaged employees are a fundamentally different product. A guest interacting with someone who understands the business, has context about that specific day, feels valued by the organization, and has genuine pride in the property they work for. That interaction is categorically different from an interaction with someone who is punching the clock and waiting to go home. And in a business where almost every competitive advantage is ultimately felt through human interaction, the difference between those two categories of employee engagement is the difference between a good stay and a great one. Between a guest who comes back and one who doesn't. Aziz put it plainly, imagine taking 10,000 employees and having each one of them genuinely want to give more, not perform adequately, want to give more. The arithmetic of that, compounded across millions of guest interactions over years, is transformative in ways that no renovation budget or marketing campaign can replicate. The larger business context in which all of this was happening deserves some attention, because the story does not end in good times. Las Vegas Strip revenues grew from around $18.5 billion in 2000 to nearly $31 billion by 2007, a golden era of expansion that made almost everyone on the Strip look good. And then 2008 arrived. The financial crisis hit Las Vegas with particular ferocity. Hotel bookings collapsed, gaming revenues fell sharply. Properties that had loaded up on debt to fund massive expansions found themselves in desperate straits. The entire city had a reckoning. The MGM Grand had to cut spending on some of its recognition programs. Budgets were compressed. The pressure was real. And Aziz did something that was, in the context of a financial crisis, not the obvious move. Before implementing any cuts, he sat down with employees and explained exactly what was happening. Not a memo, not a town hall where executives read from talking points. An honest conversation about the challenges the hotel faced and a commitment made publicly to the people who worked there that the relationship with employees was not going to be discarded the moment it became expensive to maintain. That choice reflected a belief that is easy to state and genuinely difficult to act on. That employee engagement is more important during hard times, not less. That the culture you build over years is most valuable precisely when it is tested. That if you treat engagement as a nice to have that gets cut when margins compress, you communicate to everyone in the building exactly how seriously you really meant all of it. The property got through the crisis. The culture that had been built, the daily communication, the sense of shared stakes, the genuine investment in the people doing the work, proved more resilient than the budget lines that had supported it. When things improved, the foundation was intact. What Gamal Aziz built at the MGM Grand between 2001 and his move to run the parent company's global hospitality division a decade later was not, at its core, a renovation project. It was not primarily a strategic repositioning or a brand refresh or a real estate story, though it was all of those things in part. At its core, it was a demonstration that the most powerful source of competitive advantage in a people-driven business is, quite simply, the people, and that the gap between how most organizations treat their frontline workforce and how they could treat them represents an enormous, largely untapped reservoir of performance. The hospitality industry had spent decades solving for every variable except that one: better rooms, better technology, better loyalty programs, better marketing, better celebrity partnerships. And all of those things matter, but none of them change the fundamental experience of a guest the way that an engaged, informed, genuinely invested employee does in the moment when it counts. The pre-shift meeting, 15 minutes, every shift, every department, every day, is perhaps the most elegant piece of the entire model because it is so simple and so replicable in almost any organization. It costs essentially nothing. It requires no capital investment and no technology. It simply closes the information gap between the people making decisions and the people executing them. And closing that gap reliably and consistently transforms the quality of hundreds of thousands of micro decisions made every day across a massive operation. What made Aziz unusual was not that he had this insight, it's that he acted on it with structural consistency rather than as an occasional gesture. He didn't open communication when things were good and close it down when things got hard. He didn't treat employee recognition as a program that ran when the budget allowed. He built systems, repeating, mandatory, embedded in the daily rhythm of the organization, that made the values real rather than decorative. There is a version of leadership in hospitality and in business generally that treats frontline workers as a cost to be minimized and a compliance issue to be managed. That version was, for most of the 20th century, essentially the default. Aziz's version treated them as the product, as the actual thing that guests were buying when they booked a room at the MGM Grand. And in an industry where every major hotel on the Strip has access to the same celebrity chefs, the same Cirque du Soleil partnerships, the same architectural firms, the same luxury amenity vendors, in that industry, the employee is essentially the only truly differentiated asset. You can copy a menu, you can copy a design concept, you can copy a loyalty program. You cannot quickly copy a culture where 10,000 people actually want to give more. That was the MGM Grand's strategic weapon. And it was standing in the building on every shift, waiting for someone to ask it what it knew. The story has a complicated coda that is worth acknowledging, because no profile of Gamal Aziz should omit it. In 2019, he was swept up in the college admissions bribery scandal that became known as Varsity Blues, accused of paying to falsify his daughter's athletic credentials to gain admission to the University of Southern California. He was convicted at trial, sentenced to prison. Then, in May 2023, the First Circuit Court of Appeals overturned his conviction entirely in a unanimous three-judge ruling, finding that the charges had been based on misapplications of the law, that the evidence was insufficient to support the verdict, and that the way evidence had been presented at trial created an unacceptable risk that the jury convicted him based on other people's conduct rather than his own. He became the only accused parent in the entire Varsity Blues case to have his conviction reversed and all charges cleared. His record as a business leader stands separate from that legal saga, and the reversal means it stands unencumbered by it. What the MGM Grand story offers, regardless of what else happened in Aziz's life, is a genuinely useful model, not a perfect one. Not one without the complications that come with operating at scale in an industry with real labor challenges and environmental costs and all the other messy realities of running a massive resort in a city built on excess. But a model that proved, with measurable, documented results over more than a decade, that information shared is performance earned, that engagement is not soft, it is structural, that the question of whether your frontline employees feel seen and informed and invested in is not a feel-good HR question, it's a revenue question, it's a loyalty question, it's a competitive question. And the answer, it turns out, starts with a 15-minute meeting before every shift, where someone with authority simply tells the people who do the work, here is what is happening today, here is how the business is doing, and you deserve to know. That is where the turnaround started. Not in the boardroom, not in a renovation budget. In 10,000 people finally being told the truth about the place they worked and discovering that someone in charge actually cared whether they knew it.